And now it's better for white to attack this bishop by playing h3. And after suppose bishop to h5, now comes c4, attacking this queen. And now black is forced to go to this d7 square, and after that white can continue to attack by playing g4. Okay, and after bishop to g6, now comes d5, attacking this knight. And if takes, attacking this knight again, and clearly you can see white is better. Okay, so in the actual game after e6, here he decides to develop his bishop to e3. And in this position here white can continue this game by pushing g4, attacking this bishop, and the only square for this bishop is this g6, and now white can develop his queen to b3, attacking this b7 pawn, and the best way to defend this is simply rook to b8. But now white can go for knight to e5, targeting this bishop, but here the best move for black is to simply castle, ensuring his king's safety. But after that rook at a goes to d1, and clearly you can see white inactive pieces suddenly gets active, and by this you can see white is slightly better. Okay, so in the actual game after bishop to h5, here white decides to bring his knight to e5, asking for bishop exchange. And now it's better for black to either start pushing this h-pawn, or black can also go for bishop to f6, attacking this pawn. But here Tal decides to slide his king to f8, which is a very logical move, bringing this king into the game. And that's an inaccuracy because in the next move, Tal is going to place this bishop to b4, which attacks this rook. So that's why after this move f6, here white must consider giving a check from his rook. And suppose after takes, rook takes c7 check, king to d8, and finally bishop to g3. But after that, here black can start pushing his a pawn, but white can counter with simply rook to c6, which targets this a6 pawn, and by this game will becomes completely equal. Okay, so after bishop to f7, here Tal goes for bishop to b4, attacking this rook. Here Tal is preparing for rook to a7, which targets this bishop. And now it's better for white to just push f3, which maintains an eye over these squares. Or maybe white can push any of these pawns, and he can also bring this king to to d3 so that he can centralize this king. But instead he made a mistake by playing f4, and that's a mistake because here white fatally weakens the white king and the center. Basically, this f pawn is very important for white so that he can tackle these strong pawn chains of black. And to do this, black has to capture this f pawn first. So that's why here Tal instantly brings his bishop to c7, creating pressure over this f4 pawn. But most of you be like, bro, what's the problem? I mean, white can easily guard this by king to f3. But now Tal can simply take on f4, attacking this bishop. But what after bishop takes f4? After white captured the pawn, black can actually exchange the bishops because and after that he can bring his rook to b4, which attacks this d4 pawn, and after suppose rook to d2, since black have these strong central pawns, so that's why he can give a check. And remember this, since this d4 pawn is pinned, so this king has to go back, suppose on e3, and now black can bring his king further to e6, and if takes, and in the next move black will bring this rook to e4, and by this clearly you can see black have these two strong central passers, which gives a significant advantage to black. Okay, so in the actual game, after the move bishop takes f4, here Tal missed that move, and instead he goes for e5, which attacks this bishop. Okay, so here it's better for Tal to bring this rook to b6 so that he can attack this bishop and try to push this h-pawn. But instead he made a slight inaccuracy by bishop to b6, which looks good attacking this rook, but now white can bring this rook to e5, attacking this pawn. But some of you be like, bro, what's the problem? I can simply push this pawn to e3. But if you push e3, now black will lose all of his advantage because of king to f3. And clearly you can see white successfully stopped these pawns, and now this position is completely equal. So that's why after rook to e5, here Tal finds the best move d3, which also defends this e4 pawn by this rook. And since this rook is under attack, so Tal brings this rook to d4. Which looks good because it also guards the pawn, right? But guys, that's actually a big mistake. Yeah, because in the next move, white is going to bring his king to f5, and now you can see this e4 pawn is attacked by this king and this rook, which cannot be defended by black. So that's why at the end black will be a pawn down. So suppose if black tries to attack this rook by bishop to c7, simply rook takes e4, and if rook to d5 check, king to g4. And if black tries to attack this bishop by bishop to a5, trying to attack this bishop so that he can push this d pawn further, but simply b4. And now clearly you can see white is a pawn up, so that's why this position will be winning for white. So okay, so let's go back to our move. Yeah, rook to d4. So what's the best move for black? Guys, now comes the most crazy part of this game. Instead of this move, which is rook to d4, in this position the best move for black is to give up this rook and go for a5. Because because if suppose bishop takes b4, then after simply a takes b4. And now tell me, who is going to stop these pawns? Okay, so let's suppose if white brings his king to f4, he tries to attack this pawn, but simply bishop to c7, and white has to lose his rook. Okay, so let's go back to our move, which is a5. Yeah, suppose if black didn't capture this rook and instead he goes for king to f5, now comes e3, attacking this bishop. But what if bishop takes e3? Then simply bishop takes e3. And if rook takes e3, now we can go for rook to d4. And you can see black is going to promote this pawn in few moves. And if rook to e1, he tries to stop our pawn, then simply king to d6. And let me show you a quick variation. Suppose if king to d5, you can see both black and white are going to promote their pawns, but after king to c3, clearly you can see white is slow as compared to black, and in the next move white has to lose his rook. Okay, so in the actual game, after king to f5, here Tal missed the move bishop to c7, and instead he goes for e3. And again black must consider the move a5, but Tal goes for bishop to c7. He wants to target this rook, and the best way to tackle this is simply rook to e1, and then he can start pushing his own pawns. But instead he made a mistake by rook to e4. And now in this position, here Tal decides to bring his bishop to c5. He sacrificed his a6 pawn, and suppose if rook takes a6, now comes rook to e2, attacking this bishop so that he can push this pawn further. But white can easily tackle this by playing b4, attacking this bishop. And after suppose bishop to e7, bishop to c3, and he can also start pushing his own pawns, which cannot be stopped by black. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to c5, and now it's better for white to bring this rook to c4 and then to c3, which targets this pawn, but instead he goes for b4, which attacks his bishop. And the problem with that move is now black can bring his rook to e2 so that he can attack this bishop and promote this pawn. But suppose if takes, rook takes d2, so let's go back to our move, which is b4. Here Tal missed that move, and instead he goes for bishop to g1. Okay, so here to defend this check, either bishop to f4 or rook to f4 might be the better option, so that this black rook cannot infiltrate to this f1 square. But instead he made a mistake by king to g4, allowing black rook to infiltrate towards the first rank. And now it's better for white to not exchange this bishop and place this bishop to either this g5 square or maybe to this h6, so that he can maintain an eye over this d3 pawn. But instead he blundered by rook to f4, and that's a blunder because now Tal slides his rook to e1. He wants to attack this bishop so that he can promote his d pawn. Okay, so in this position, Tal must consider bishop to e3 so that he can exchange this bishop and promote this pawn. But instead, he made a mistake by playing bishop to d4. And now you can see white can give a check from d6 square, but white also missed that move, and instead he captured on a6. And after that, Tal brings his rook back to e4. He wants to capture this bishop so that he can promote this pawn. So that's why, to stop this, he decides to bring this rook to a3 so that he can keep an eye over this pawn. And in this position, Solmanis resigned because you can see now black is a rook up, and in the next few moves, black will easily crush all of these pawns. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.